My name is Jordan Mercer, and today I will be presenting my bachelor's essay research on the topic of party politics and criminal justice reform. So in recent years, we've seen a bigger push for criminal justice reform. A lot of this is attributed to the overcrowding of prisons and policing concerns as it relates to police brutality, which of course the Black Lives Matter movement has been a big part of, also push for criminal justice reform. So both Republicans and Democrats have suggested reforms for criminal justice. Our Senator, Republican Tim Scott, for example, suggested the Justice Act, which would require better police training that focuses more on de-escalation, the increased use of body cameras, and making lynching a federal crime. About half of the Senate co-sponsored this, so it received lots of support, but unfortunately, it did not pass. On the other side of the spectrum, we have Congresswoman Karen Bass, a Democrat from California, who suggested the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. Similar to Senator Scott's bill, this would require the increased usage of body cameras, ban chokeholds, reduce the ability for law enforcement to use lethal force, ban military equipment being used by law enforcement, and banning qualified immunity. And this got about half of the House of Representatives co-sponsoring, but unfortunately also did not pass. The research questions I aimed to answer, first of all, was why has there been no major criminal justice reform enacted? Further, why is legislation like this difficult to pass? What past reforms have succeeded, and what kinds of solutions have Democrats and Republicans supported? As I began my research, I looked at some prior literature that suggested that there are three big elements that relate to criminal justice reform. First of all, we have ideology, and Jacobs and Carmichael discuss that conservatives tend to be tougher on crime, whereas Zalman and other co-authors discuss that liberals tend to favor the matter of innocence. Second element that's related to criminal justice reform that I found in my prior research is that public opinion has an effect on criminal justice reform. Morin and other authors suggest that the reduction of incarceration, holding police accountable for their actions, and bail reform are all reforms that most Americans tend to support. And of course, Kalinsky and Elling suggest that Congress is in fact representative and that they reflect the opinions of their constituents despite major distrust in government. And finally, in my background research, I found that elections and partisanship have a major effect on criminal justice reform. Kent and Carmichael suggest that electoral considerations are a significant element in criminal justice reform, and whether or not such reform proposals will help a politician get elected or hurt their chances. And similarly, Francis Lee discusses that a lot of the times politicians oppose criminal justice reform bills not because they ideologically disagree, but because they strategically disagree in order to build up their party for upcoming elections. So the way that I collected my data was divided up into two major parts. First of all, we have public opinion data, which I gathered from a Gallup poll that asked Americans, what do you think the most important problem in America is today? And then a general survey asking Americans whether or not the amount of funding we spend on law enforcement is just right, too much, or not enough. The second set of data that I gathered was bill sponsorship data, and I got all of this from the Comparative Agendas Project. First of all, I looked at how many crime, law, and family bills are supported by party over the past several Congresses, And then specifically, I dove into the 115th Congress and distinguished what type of crime bills parties tend to be focused on. And that's divided up into executive branch bills, drug bills, family bills, policing bills, and courts and sentencing bills. So here I have a graph that represents public opinion over the past several years. So as you can see, in the early 50s and 60s, there was minimal concern about crime and law bills amongst Americans, but this takes a big spike up around 1967. Note that this is around the time of the civil rights movement. There were several race riots, the assassinations of major civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., as well as major law reforms such as Miranda rights. Then it staggers down a little bit, and then in the 90s, it takes its biggest increase, and this was due to the 1990 tough on crime era and the infamous 1994 Biden crime bill. And of course, this goes down a little bit for a little while and then spikes up again in 2014 and again in 2020 during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement with the killing of Michael Brown in 2014 and George Floyd in 2020. This graph here represents my findings on Americans' opinions on the amount of law enforcement funding we provide. The blue line here shows us the amount of Americans who think we spend too little funding on law enforcement. The orange is just right, and the gray line represents the fact that we spend too much on law enforcement. If you can see the amount of Americans who think that we spend too little from 1980s until today, hovers around the same percentage. For the most part, in the 90s, it declines because of the tough on crime era, and then it plummets at 2020 after the George Floyd killings. And of course, the amount of people who think that we spend the right amount or too much money sort of mirrors that. So I took those results and I divided them up by party, and this graph represents the amount of Republicans and Democrats who think that the amount of law enforcement is too little. And what's interesting is that we see that Republicans and Democrats sort of follow each other here on this graph. But once we get to 2014, again, the shooting of Michael Brown, the Republicans and Democrats take off in opposite directions, with far more Republicans thinking that we spend too little on law enforcement and far less Democrats thinking we spend too much. And here we have the mirrored graph, which shows the amount of Democrats and Republicans who think that our amount of law enforcement funding is too much. And of course, again, we see from 2014 onward, the amount of Democrats who think that we spend too much money on law enforcement increases dramatically, whereas the amount of Republicans decreases. Second set of results that I gathered were bill sponsorship data from the 115th Congress. What's interesting is that from this congressional session, which was 2017 to 2019, the amount of crime and law bills sponsored by Republicans and Democrats was nearly equal, with more Republicans tending to favor bills as they relate to sentencing and courts, and more Democrats favoring bills as it relates to policing. And this shows the amount of Republican and Democrat proposals for crime and law bills over the years from the 1940s until 2019. So we see in the 1940s through the early 60s, the amount of bills are relatively low, and then they take a bigger spike up in the 60s. Again, this was civil rights movement. Then what's interesting is that we see in the 90s to about 2015, the amount of Republican and Democrat bills sponsored oscillates, and this is because Republicans and Democrats continually switched off having control over Congress. And so whoever had control over Congress ended up sponsoring the most amount of bills. And then, of course, what we just discussed, the 115th Congress from 2017 to 2019 was about the same. The conclusions that I reached from my project here, why did criminal justice reform succeed in the past but not today? Well, public opinion shifted significantly over the years, and attitudes were not quite as polarized as they are today. Now, speaking of today, public opinion has polarized in the past 5 years. Democrats and Republicans tend to be equally active when it comes to proposing reform bills, but they prioritize different solutions. And of course, parties in compromise are, parties tend to neglect to compromise, especially when we are in near close elections, because you want to lift your party up and bring the other down. One limitation that I faced during my research was that the data ends for the bill sponsorship in the 115th Congress. This is just a few weeks before the killing of George Floyd. So the data does not represent the political and cultural response. And of course, if I were to have more time and look into further research, I would narrow my scope down. As you can see, crime bills are very broad. It can range from family bills to policing, so I would narrow that scope down and look further into sentencing and policing bills specifically. That concludes my presentation. I just want to thank Dr. Jordan Mercer for advising me, Senator Tim Scott for allowing me to sit down and interview him personally, and the Political Science Department for all of their mentorship. Thank you.